The UAP Herald Case File 023, The Venus Opinion. I want to start on a train, somewhere in the Soviet Union, in the spring of 1967, because this file is not in the end about a light in the sky. It is about a quiet, careful piece of espionage, so gentle you would almost miss it, and about a room full of some of the finest scientists in the world being asked one by one a single strange question. The man on the train was an American, an astrophysicist on the staff of a large research institute. He was in the USSR for a month, at the coldest depth of the Cold War, on what looked like an ordinary academic tour, going from observatory to observatory, meeting the Soviet astronomers who studied the planets. And as he went, in Moscow, in Leningrad, in Kiev, in the Crimea, out in the far republics of Central Asia, he asked each of them, almost in passing, what they made of flying saucers. Then he went home, and he wrote it all down, every answer, every joke, every hesitation. He wrote a memorandum for his superiors, and an Air Force intelligence office took that private memo, edited it, stamped it confidential, and turned it into a report of the Central Intelligence Agency. Tonight, that report, a real declassified CIA document, dated the 21st of August, 1967, held for 59 years, and handed back to the public in 2026. 2 pages, and it is one of the most quietly fascinating things we have ever read on this channel, because it is a photograph taken from the inside of what the Soviet scientific elite actually believed about UFOs in a moment when nobody was performing for a camera. And because this is a Herald file, I am going to tell you the shape of it up front, so no one can accuse us of selling a mystery we cannot deliver. There is no crashed craft in this document. There is no alien. There is one sighting the witnesses themselves suspected was a burning rocket fragment. There is one case that gets completely solved on the page as car headlights, and there is one line, one astonishing personal opinion from a man who had survived the Gulag, that the flying saucers, quote, may originate on Venus. That opinion is not evidence, it is one brilliant, haunted man's guess. But the fact that a CIA report took the trouble to write it down and carry it home across the Iron Curtain tells you something real. Let's read it. First, as always, the object itself, the piece of paper, before we weigh a single word of what it says, because the provenance is the whole reason to trust it. This is a CIA information report. Look at the top of the page, and it announces exactly what it is, and exactly how much weight to give it.
Central Intelligence Agency. Controlled DISM, no DISM abroad. Confidential. Country USSR. Report number 00-B-321/23490-67. Date of information, May 1967.
2 markings on this header do a lot of work, and I do not want to skate past them, because honesty about how good your evidence is, that is the whole game here. The first is stamped across the middle of the page, and it is the most important caveat in the entire document.
This is unevaluated information.
Unevaluated. That is the intelligence world's way of saying, this is raw. Nobody has checked it. Nobody has graded it true or false. It is a report of what a source said, passed up the chain exactly as received. So everything in this file, every quote from every Soviet scientist, comes to us at second hand, filtered through one traveler's memory and one intelligence officer's typewriter. We are going to treat it that way. And the second marking tells you who that traveler was and who really wrote this up.
Source: a U.S. citizen, an astrophysicist on the staff of a large research institute. The information in this report was extracted from a memorandum he wrote for his superiors. This report was developed by an Air Force representative assigned to the Office of Preparation.
So follow that chain, because it matters. A real American astrophysicist takes a trip. He writes a private memo about it for his own bosses. An Air Force Intelligence Office, the abbreviation on the page is AFNIN, an Air Force Intelligence designation, gets hold of that memo and works it into a formal CIA information report. The scientist almost certainly never imagined his casual travel notes would end up stamped confidential and filed in Langley. But that is the quiet machinery of the Cold War, an academic souvenirs of a trip, quietly harvested for intelligence value. And the only reason you and I can read it now is a line of fresh, modern ink across the top of a 59-year-old page.
Approved for release 2026.
The current UFO records law, the same statute prying open file after file we have read on this channel. So, a genuine, confidential CIA report, built from a real scientist's trip through the Soviet Union, released by the government that wrote it. Now let's follow the traveler. Paragraph 1 sets the scene, and it is important that you hear how modest, how almost accidental, the whole UFO angle of this trip really was. This was not a spy mission to steal saucer secrets. Listen.
This report is an account of conversational exchanges on the subject of UFOs during the course of a one-month trip of a U.S. scientist through the USSR in the spring of 1967 for the purpose of visiting several astronomical observatories having staff members engaged in planetary research. The only scientists contacted during the trip were astronomers, and inquiries concerning Soviet observations and interpretations of UFOs were a minor aspect of the trip.
A minor aspect of the trip. That phrase is doing something beautiful, and I want you to hold on to it. This man was not there to investigate flying saucers. He was there to talk about the planets, about Mars and Venus, and the serious business of 1960s planetary astronomy. The saucer question was a side conversation, the thing you ask over tea when the formal session is done. And that is exactly what makes his notes so valuable. When you set out to investigate UFOs, people perform for you. They give you the answer they think you came to hear. But when it is just a passing question between two working astronomers, colleague to colleague, you get something rarer. You get what they actually think. This whole document is a collection of unguarded moments, the real off-the-record opinions of the Soviet scientific establishment about the strangest subject of the century. And here is the frame that holds the entire file together, the thing the traveler was really measuring. It was 1967. In the United States, UFOs were a national circus. Project Blue Book, the tabloids, the ridicule, the coming Condon investigation. The question buried inside this trip was, what does the other superpower think? Behind the Iron Curtain, do the serious scientists take this seriously? Or do they laugh? So let's go with him, observatory by observatory, and find out. The first stop is Moscow, the Sternberg Astronomical Institute, one of the great centers of Soviet astronomy. And the first answer he gets is a shrug. Listen.
He visited V.I. Moroz, Sternberg Institute, Moscow, who was non-committal on the subject of UFOs.
Non-committal. Nothing to see here. And for the record, V.I. Moroz was no lightweight. Vasily Moroz was one of the leading Soviet planetary astronomers of the era, a serious man who spent his career studying the atmospheres of the planets. When a scientist of that caliber goes non-committal, he is telling you he does not want to touch the subject. But then comes the moment that made me smile, because it is so human and so perfectly Cold War. The traveler had a translator, another astronomer, a radio astronomer, and this man had a joke ready.
The scientist who served as translator, a radio astronomer, emphatically stated that he knew of no sightings of UFOs in the USSR, and added with a laugh that if they were only seen in the US, they must be of Soviet origin.
If they are only seen in America, they must be ours. That is a wonderful line, and it is more than a joke. It is a whole worldview compressed into a single quip. To this Soviet astronomer, the entire American saucer phenomenon is so obviously a product of American culture, American anxiety, American imagination, maybe American secret aircraft, that the funniest possible explanation is that the UFOs are just another US military project the Americans have not been told about. He is not frightened of saucers. He finds the whole thing a little ridiculous. That is the first data point, and it is the flavor of a lot of what follows. Not fear, not belief, amusement. The next stop moves the needle, just slightly. The Pulkovo Observatory outside Leningrad, a place with its own tragic history, largely destroyed in the siege of the city during the war and rebuilt from the rubble. And here, for the first time, someone admits they have heard something.
At the Pulkovo Observatory, Leningrad, one of the astronomers mentioned that she had heard of some sightings of unidentified objects near the Caucasus. She was unaware of any study being made of them, but was open-minded on the subject.
Sightings near the Caucasus. No study, open-minded. It is a small thing. A rumor of sightings in the mountains of the south, with nobody officially looking into them. But notice the geography, because it is a pattern in this file. The sightings cluster near the Caucasus, near the northern USSR, near the far edges of Kazakhstan, the strategic, sensitive, rocket and radar borderlands of the Soviet Union. The document never says a word about that, but an intelligence officer reading it in 1967 would have noticed exactly where these lights were being seen. And now we come to the heart of the file, the man the traveler had really come to see. Paragraph 4, his main visit. Because if the others gave him a shrug and a joke, this one gave him something no debunking book could contain. Here is how the report puts it.
The U.S. scientist's main visit was to N.A. Kozyrev, who was very interested in the problem. He had read Menzel's book, which has been translated into Russian, but did not accept his conclusions.
Now, before we go further, you have to understand who N.A. Kozyrev was, because it changes everything about how you hear that sentence. This is not some fringe enthusiast. This is one of the most extraordinary and most tragic figures in the history of Russian science. Here is the record, and I want you to sit with it.
Nikolai Alexandrovich Kozyrev was a brilliant young Soviet astrophysicist, a prodigy. In 1936, during Stalin's purges, he was arrested in the terror that swept the Pulkovo Observatory, where much of the staff was executed or died in the camps. He was sentenced to 10 years for counter-revolutionary activity. In prison, he was given a second 10-year sentence. In 1942, he was sentenced to death, and the sentence was reversed. He spent roughly a decade in the Gulag, cut off from all scientific literature, and was not released until the late 1940s. He is named in Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, and by his own account, some of his deepest scientific ideas took shape in that cell, worked out in his head with no books, from memory.
Read that again and let it land. A death sentence, reversed. A decade in the camps. And he came out the other side and went back to the stars. This is the man who, in 1967, reads the leading American book, Debunking Flying Saucers. Donald Menzel, the Harvard astronomer, who spent his life arguing that every saucer was a misperceived cloud or star, and quietly says, "No, I do not accept his conclusions." And then, the report tells us what Kozyrev did believe, and it is a small masterpiece of scientific dissent under a censor's eye.
Kozyrev knew of some sightings in the northern part of the USSR, but said that reports of such sightings are not printed in Soviet newspapers because they are not regarded as scientific observations.
Not printed because they are not regarded as scientific observations. And right here, the report's author cannot help himself. He inserts a comment, a dry little dagger of Cold War irony, right into the middle of the paragraph.
Comment. This is interesting in view of the readiness of Soviet newspapers to print rather fantastic reports of hypotheses and observations suggested by the more imaginative members of the scientific community. Apparently, some official sanction is needed.
In other words, Soviet papers will happily print all sorts of wild scientific speculation, but not this, not sources, which tells the analyst that somewhere quietly an official hand had decided the subject was off limits. Some official sanction is needed. Now hold that, because it is the counterweight to the single most famous line in this document, the line that gives tonight its name. The report finishes the thought about Kozyrev like this.
Kozyrev has been interested in U.S. reports of UFOs and readily accepts their reality. In fact, it is his personal opinion that the UFOs may originate on Venus.
It is his personal opinion that the UFOs may originate on Venus. There it is. A man who survived the Gulag, a serious astrophysicist, telling an American colleague, over tea, off the record, that he thinks the sources might come from the second planet. And I have to be honest about how to hold that sentence, because this is exactly where a lesser channel would lie to you. It is not proof of anything, and it is not a Soviet government position. The report flags it precisely. It is his personal opinion, one man's guess. And by 1967, we already knew from spacecraft that the surface of Venus is a broiling hell, hot enough to melt lead. Nobody is launching sources from there. So as a physical claim, Kozyrev is simply wrong. And we say so plainly. But that is not why the line matters. It matters because of who said it, and the report tells us he was no crank. Listen to how it defends his judgment.
Comment. Kozyrev is a controversial figure in the Soviet scientific community as well as internationally. Apparently, one of his questionable observations, the activity of the central peak in the lunar crater Alphonsus, has turned out to be correct.
And that part is real and documented. In 1958, Kozyrev pointed the Great Reflector at the Crimean Astrophysical Observatory at a crater on the Moon called Alphonsus and reported the spectrum of a gas cloud, a flash of activity on a world everyone assumed was dead. The claim was fiercely controversial. It still is. His interpretation has never been fully confirmed, and we will be honest about that. But the man who looked at the dead moon and insisted something was happening there and would not be shouted down. That is the same stubbornness looking at the saucer reports and refusing to accept they were all clouds. The report is not telling you Kozyrev was right about Venus. It is telling you he was the kind of scientist you could not wave away, and that is a more interesting thing to carry home in a CIA file than any saucer. So far, we have had opinions, a shrug, a joke, a rumor, a haunted man's guess. But paragraphs 5 and 6 give us the one thing in this whole document that comes close to a real sighting, and I want to hold it exactly as carefully as the witnesses themselves did. The main astronomical observatory in Kiev. Listen.
At the main astronomical observatory, Kiev, little interest is shown in the UFO question. I.K. Koval mentioned that he and several other astronomers had been out in the countryside one evening and had seen a curious reddish object flashing through the sky that they were convinced was neither a satellite nor a meteorite.
Stop there for a moment. This is the good part, evidentially, because it is not a rumor and it is not an opinion. It is a group of professional astronomers, people who spend their lives looking at the night sky, who know exactly what a satellite looks like and exactly what a meteor looks like, standing in a field, watching a curious reddish object flash across the sky, and agreeing together that it was neither of those things. When trained observers rule out the ordinary, you lean in. But now watch what those same trained observers do next, because this is the part a dishonest storyteller would cut, and it is the most important sentence in the paragraph.
However, their immediate interpretation was that this object might have been a fragment of a satellite or rocket returning from orbit, burning up in the atmosphere. Koval thought that UFOs had been seen in the USSR, but he could not be specific as to locations and characteristics.
There it is. The witnesses themselves, the very astronomers who saw it, immediately reached for the mundane answer. A reddish object, flashing, burning. That is exactly what a chunk of a spent rocket or a dying satellite looks like as it re-enters the atmosphere and burns. They did not run to the newspapers shouting saucer. They said, probably space debris. And that is the honest weight of this sighting. It is real, it is first-hand, it is from credible observers, and the observers themselves offered the boring explanation. That is what a genuinely careful scientist does. He is struck by the thing, and he still reaches for the ordinary cause first. And yet, there is a coda at the next observatory, in the Crimea, that keeps the door open just a crack.
At the Crimean Astrophysical Observatory, again little interest was shown. One of the astronomers, L.I. Galkin, was with the group mentioned by Koval and confirmed the observation of a peculiar object. He did not discuss the experience in detail, but clearly had been struck by the possibility that the object might have been a saucer.
A second witness, Galkin, confirms it. Same event, independent voice. He will not say much, but the report notes that he, quietly, had been struck by the possibility that it might have been a saucer. So there is the whole shape of the best case in this file, in miniature. One man says rocket fragment. The other man, who stood in the same field, could not quite let go of the word saucer. Neither of them knows. Both of them are honest about not knowing. That is not a cover-up, and it is not proof. It is two careful people disagreeing gently about a light in the sky, which, if we are honest, is where most of this subject actually lives. The last observatory is the most interesting, because it is where the file does something almost nobody in the UFO world ever does. It solves a case, cleanly, on the page. The Astrophysical Institute at Alma-Ata, far out in Kazakhstan. And here, finally, there is real appetite for the subject. Listen.
At the Astrophysical Institute Alma-Ata, there was considerable interest. However, the initial discussion of the problem was with the director of the institute, G.M. Idlis. He too had read Menzel's book, but considered it an adequate treatment of the subject, which he consequently felt was closed.
So the director starts as a skeptic. He has read the American debunking book, he finds it convincing, and for him, the matter is settled, closed. And then the traveler does the one thing that reopens a closed mind. He does not argue. He just shows him the other side of the American argument.
He indicated that no observations of UFOs had been made by his staff. However, when the U.S. scientists proceeded to indicate the results of McDonald's critical study of the problem, Idlis readily conceded that there might be more to it, and concluded by stating that it was, quote, clearly still an open question.
McDonald. That name matters. James McDonald was an American atmospheric physicist at the University of Arizona, and in exactly this period, the mid-1960s, he was becoming the most serious scientific voice, arguing that UFOs deserved real study and that the Air Force had handled them sloppily. So watch what happens here. A Soviet Institute director has read only the skeptic, Menzel, and closed the case. The American shows him the other serious scientist, McDonald, and the director immediately, honestly, reopens it. Clearly still an open question. That is science working exactly as it should, across the Iron Curtain, over a single conversation. Neither man is a believer. Both of them just follow the argument where it goes. And then, the solved case. Because right in the middle of all this open-mindedness, the report drops one cold, clean, mundane resolution, almost as an aside.
Another astronomer mentioned that in the northern part of Kazakhstan, there had been repeated sightings of ball lightning. The university in Alma-Ata had sent a team out to investigate and discovered that what was being seen were reflections of automobile headlights from an inversion layer.
Reflections of automobile headlights from an inversion layer. Read that, because it is the honest heart of this whole episode. Here is a wave of mysterious lights, repeated sightings, in a remote region, exactly the kind of thing that becomes a saucer legend. And the Soviet scientists did not shrug and did not believe. They sent a team. They investigated, and they found the answer: car headlights, bent and lifted over the horizon by a temperature inversion in the atmosphere so that the beams appeared as strange lights in the sky. Case closed. A real, mundane, provable explanation. That single paragraph is why I trust the rest of the document. A report trying to sell you on flying saucers would have left it out. This one puts it right there next to Kozyrev and Venus, with no embarrassment at all. The mystery and the solution side by side, exactly as an honest observer would record them. And the file rounds out Alma-Ata with two more open-minded scientists. Lifshitz, who ran the atmospheric optics section and was, quote, not very impressed with the significance of the phenomenon, but willing to look, and a stellar spectroscopist, Dr. Kupo, curious about the sightings as a side effect of her real work hunting fragments of meteorites. Curious, unconvinced, willing to keep looking. That is the tone of the whole tour. And then, at the very end, the traveler stops reporting other people's opinions and gives us his own. One closing paragraph that is, quietly, the most important and the most unsettling thing in the entire file. Because it stops being about sources and becomes about how a superpower might use them. Paragraph 11. His overall conclusion. Read it slowly.
The general feeling one gets is that no official treatment of the UFO problem has been given in the USSR. Instead, people refer to the US work, principally Menzel's book, to demonstrate the absence of real scientific problems. At the same time, there is an almost universal awareness of the history and characteristics of the phenomenon, often associated with considerable interest.
So there is his summary of the Soviet mind on this, and it is subtle. Officially, nothing. No Soviet government study, no acknowledgement. And to wave the whole thing away, the Soviet scientists reach for the American skeptic Menzel. They use our debunker to close their own subject. But underneath that official silence, he finds something else entirely. Almost universal awareness and considerable interest. Every astronomer he met knew the phenomenon. Many were quietly fascinated by it. The disinterest was a posture. The curiosity was real. And then comes the sentence that turns this from a travelogue into an intelligence document. The reason, I suspect, an Air Force office bothered to write the whole thing up at all.
The result is that a demonstration of the inadequacy of US official explanations, coupled with some proof of the reality of the observations, might excite enthusiasm more rapidly among Soviet astronomers than among their US counterparts, who are more strongly influenced by the official ridicule associated with UFOs in the US.
Sit with what that is actually saying. He is telling his superiors, the Soviet scientists are less poisoned by ridicule than ours are. In America, the official mockery, the blue book jokes, the tabloid stigma, has made serious scientists afraid to touch the subject. The Soviets have not been through that. So if you wanted to light a fire of genuine scientific UFO research, you might get it going faster over there than here. It is a cool, analytical observation about which population of scientists is more open to persuasion. And coming through an Air Force intelligence office at the height of the Cold War, it reads uncomfortably like a man mapping where an idea might be planted. We will not overclaim it. He does not say do this, and there is no evidence anyone acted on it. But the shape of the thought is unmistakable. And here is the piece of history that makes the timing extraordinary. The information in this report is dated May 1967, and that very month, May 1967, the first official Soviet UFO study group was quietly holding its first meeting in Moscow, led by a major general named Stolyarov, with a scientist named Felix Ziegel as his deputy. Here is the record.
In May 1967, the first official Soviet UFO study group met at the Moscow Aviation Center, chaired by Major General Pyotr Stolyarov, with Felix Ziegel as deputy. By that autumn, the group had swelled to some 200 members, scientists, engineers, and military officers. On the 10th of November 1967, Ziegel went on Soviet Central Television and appealed for the public to send in their sightings. Within months, the effort was abruptly shut down, and the Academy of Sciences passed a resolution against the study of UFOs. In early 1968, Ziegel received a letter from Edward Condon, the head of the American UFO study, proposing that the two sides cooperate.
So look at what our quiet traveler was actually standing in the middle of, whether he fully knew it or not. At the exact moment he was going observatory to observatory, being told there was no official Soviet interest in UFOs, an official Soviet UFO study was being born a few hundred miles away and would be strangled in its crib within the year. The astronomers who told him there was nothing to see may not have been lying. They may simply not have known yet, or may have known exactly how dangerous the subject was to touch. That is the real texture of this file. Two superpowers, at the same instant, both quietly fascinated by the same lights in the sky, and both officially pretending they were not. So let's do the deflation properly, the way we always do, because there is a calm, reasonable reading of this file, and you deserve the strongest version of it. Here is the case for it being nothing much at all.
You have spent half an hour making a 2-page travel memo sound like a thriller. Strip the music away and look at what is actually on these pages. Not one sighting in this entire document survives scrutiny. The only first-hand case, Koval's reddish object, was explained by the witnesses themselves as burning rocket debris. The one investigation anyone actually ran, the Kazakhstan lights, was solved as car headlights. Every other item is a rumor, a shrug, or an opinion. Moroz says nothing. The translator makes a joke. A Pulkovo astronomer heard of something from somebody. And your grand emotional centerpiece, Kozyrev's Venus theory, is one man's personal guess. And it is flatly, physically wrong. Venus is a furnace. This is not intelligence about UFOs. It is a snapshot of some tired astronomers being politely humored by a visiting colleague. Read without a soundtrack, it says exactly what Menzel always said. There is nothing here but misidentified ordinary things and human imagination.
And most of that is fair. I will say it plainly because honesty cuts both ways on this channel. On the physical evidence, the skeptic wins, and it is not close. There is no craft in this file. The best sighting was probably space debris, by the witness's own account. The one solved case was headlights. Kozyrev's Venus opinion is wrong. If you came here for proof that sources are real, this document does not give it to you, and anyone who tells you it does is selling you something. But there are two things the calm reading cannot quite dissolve, and neither of them is about aliens. They are about people and about power. The first is that the skeptic is measuring this file against the wrong ruler. This was never a sighting report. It is an opinion survey, an unguarded census of what the finest scientific minds of the rival superpower actually believed about the strangest subject of the age. And judged as that, it is valuable and surprising. You would expect hard Soviet materialists to laugh the whole thing out of the room. Some do, the joke, the shrug, but a striking number do not. Kozyrev accepts the reality of the sightings outright. Idlis reopens a closed mind in a single conversation. Galkin cannot let go of the word saucer. Under the official silence, the traveler finds, quote, almost universal awareness, often associated with considerable interest. That is a real finding, and not what the propaganda of either side would have predicted. And the second thing, the one I cannot quite shake, is that last paragraph. Because the deflationary reading treats this as an innocent travelogue, and the document itself will not let you. Somebody took a scientist's private trip notes and ran them through an Air Force intelligence office, and the conclusion that office chose to preserve was not about whether sources are real, it was about which nation's scientists could be more easily moved on the subject. Whatever you believe about the lights in the sky, that is a real, documented instinct. To look at a foreign scientific community and quietly ask, how open are they to being persuaded? The sources may be nothing. The impulse to weaponize belief about them is not nothing at all. Let's lay the timeline down flat, so you can see the whole shape of it without the narration.
1936, the astronomer Nikolai Kozyrev is arrested in the Stalinist purge of the Pulkovo Observatory. He will spend roughly a decade in the Gulag and be sentenced to death once before his release. 1953, Donald Menzel, the Harvard astronomer, publishes his flying saucer debunking, later translated into Russian and read across the Soviet astronomy world. 1958, Kozyrev reports his controversial spectrum of activity in the lunar crater Alphonsus. October 1966. The American physicist James McDonald begins publicly arguing that UFOs deserve serious scientific study. Spring-May 1967, an American astrophysicist tours Soviet observatories, Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, the Crimea, Alma-Ata, and quietly asks each astronomer about UFOs. That same May, the first official Soviet UFO study group holds its first meeting in Moscow under General Stolyarov with Felix Ziegel as deputy. 18th of August, 1967. The traveler's notes, developed by an Air Force intelligence office, are distributed as a confidential CIA information report. Late 1967. The Soviet study group is abruptly shut down. The Academy of Sciences turns against UFO research. Early 1968. Edward Condon, head of the American study, writes to Ziegel proposing cooperation. 2026. The report is re-released to the public.
That is the spine. Every date on it is on paper. And notice the thing at the center of it, the astonishing coincidence the traveler himself may never have seen, that in the very month he was being told the Soviets had no interest in flying saucers, the Soviets were opening their first official investigation into them. So let's do the thing this channel exists to do. Separate what we know from what we do not, with no thumb on the scale. What we know. We know this file is real, a confidential CIA information report dated August 1967, built from an American astrophysicist's month-long trip through the Soviet Union, and released in 2026. We know it is explicitly labeled unevaluated, raw, unchecked, second-hand. We know it records real, named Soviet scientists, Moroz, Kozyrev, Koval, Galkin, Idlis, giving their private opinions on UFOs. We know Kozyrev was a real and remarkable astronomer who survived the Gulag, and that the report records his personal opinion that the sources may originate on Venus. We know one first-hand sighting is described, Koval's reddish object, which the witnesses themselves suspected was space debris, and we know one case was investigated and solved outright. The Kazakhstan lights were headlight reflections through an inversion layer. Now what we do not know, and we will not shrink the list to make the story neater. We do not know whether the traveler's second-hand quotes are word-perfect. This is one man's memory, filtered through an intelligence typist. We cannot independently confirm the private UFO opinions of most of these scientists beyond this document. Kozyrev's Venus view, in particular, appears nowhere else we could find, so we give it to you exactly as the report does, as his stated personal opinion, and nothing more. We do not know who the American traveler was. His name is not in the file, and most importantly, this document tells us nothing whatsoever about whether any genuine unidentified craft exists. It never claims to. It is not a measurement of the sky. It is a measurement of what people believed about it, on one side of the Iron Curtain, in one cold spring. So what do we do with a file like this? We do not tell you it proves aliens. It does not, and it never tried to. The best sighting was probably space debris. The one solved case was headlights, and the man who thought the sources came from Venus was on that point simply wrong. Anyone who sells you this document as proof of visitors is lying to you, and we are not in that business. But we will not let the mundane pieces bury what is actually here, because what is here, read cold and read honestly, is a small, human, unforgettable thing. A photograph of two superpowers looking at the same lights in the same sky, and both officially pretending they saw nothing. It is the sound of a joke and a shrug, and a director quietly changing his mind. It is a survivor of the Gulag who came back from a death sentence and went back to the stars, telling an American over tea that the sources might come from Venus, not because he had proof, but because he had never been taught to be ashamed of wondering. The most honest sentence in the whole file is the one about the headlights, and the most human one is Kozyrev's Venus, and the fact that a nation carried both of them home across the Iron Curtain in the same confidential report is the whole strange truth of this subject in 2 pages. Case File 023. The Venus Opinion. Filed. This episode was investigated and produced by an autonomous multi-agent AI system. The real declassified report read line by line, every claim checked against independent sources, and every place we could not confirm something flagged out loud, with nothing extraterrestrial stated as fact. The case file and the source link are in the pinned comment. The UAP Harold. Declassified. Investigated. Filed.